All right, ladies and gentlemen, welcome to another episode of Faith Unaltered. I think we're on like episode 630 now, so that's awesome. But no, I just wanted to say thank you to everyone being here, and thank you to our literal last minute, pretty much last 24 hour, let's put it like that, guest, Father John Whiteford. Thank you, Father, for joining us tonight. And to be honest, and you can ask Dell this, I didn't even know we had a show tonight. So I thought another show was scheduled. And this is probably making me look really bad, but that's okay. I don't care. I'm completely transparent, right? But I thought Josh Davidson had a show lined up with Tim Barber, who, for those who don't know, debated Protestant Baptist, Reformed Baptist scholar in some circles, others not so much, James White, on the topic of open theism. And we were originally scheduled to have an interview with him last Friday, but unfortunately things didn't work out that way. We ended up having an open mic, and I thought that was tonight. And once I realized that wasn't, I immediately hit up Father John. I said, hey, we had a discussion about the Ukrainian Orthodox Church that I'd been following on your Twitter for a little bit. And I said, do you want to do that show this Friday? Mind you, this was yesterday. And Father's like, yes, let's do it. So I was like, lifesaver. So thank you, Father, for being here. I appreciate it. So Dell, you're with us tonight. And so what we're going to discuss, obviously the state of the Ukrainian Orthodox Church, is a relatively new subject for me and a brand new subject for Dell. And so we're both going to be playing the question askers, the inquirers of this subject, because there is not a lot I know about how the Ukrainian Orthodox Church, depending on which one you're talking about, came to be. I didn't know there was two. As Father John said earlier, before we came on here live, a real one and a fake one. All right, fair enough. We're going to get into that. And so I think this is going to be a really interesting topic, definitely an interesting learning experience for the hosts and hopefully for our audience's members as well. And so, Dell, without further ado, I will bring you on to ask you, how in the world have you been doing since the last time we met with Shabir Ali Tuesday night, I think it was.
Yeah. I really enjoyed the show with Shabir Ali. I know it was some people in your audience were hoping more for like a debate type format, but
yeah, they wanted to fight.
What they didn't realize, we already did that, right? This was a follow up because we ran out of time on the show with Dane versus Shabir on the Trinity, and you had some follow up questions for him. So Shabir was actually doing us a favor by coming back and kind of answering your follow up questions. So
right.
It was a different format, but I thought in terms of the format, I thought it went great. Shabir had great answers from his perspective. Obviously, we disagreed with that. I did my show last night. That's the last show. I'm on a vacation for September after this on biblical prophecies with Jordan Offhammer. So I wasn't expecting to have a show tonight, but here I am.
Here we are.
As you said, it's something I've never heard about or thought about in terms of the Ukrainian church. So I'll be doing a lot of probing and learning tonight.
Yeah, that's right. And I just wanted to, mentioning the Shabir Ali episode, so thank you for those who have been praying for me. I feel 100 times better. I was sicker than a dog. So what had happened was I took Dayquil right before I came on, and once Shabir started getting, not fiery, because Shabir is the most timid, like relaxed guy you'll ever meet and interact with. Really, he doesn't get hot that I've seen anyway, and that I've experienced. But after Dale started off asking some questions on my behalf, and once I began engaging with Shabir, I think the Dayquil started really kicking in, and I was like, okay, cool. There was a point where it started kind of tapering off. Obviously, unfortunately, Dayquil doesn't last forever, but it is what it is, right? And so I had left, and then I was still on camera, but I had it set up to where it was like so, and you all didn't hear from me. And the next thing our audience knows, I completely just backed out, and I'd said to Dale in the private chat, hey, buddy, I got to go. Long story short, the Dayquil wore off, and I felt like crap. And so I did not I did not feel like being on camera at that time. And so I just want to thank everybody for participating. That will not happen tonight. And because I'm feeling a lot better. And so thank you for your prayers, and thank God who has given me, restored me back to health. And I really appreciate it. And so thank God, and thank you to those who were praying. But let's jump into this. I see Jamie's here with us, and Amber. Tyler did. Yes, Tyler did get a haircut. My wife said, "Hey, you need to rock, because go back and watch the Shabir Ali episode. My hair, I was getting shaggy, y'all." And she said, "Hey, you need to do a high and tight." And I said, "I'll meet you in the middle." She said, "Okay." So that's what I've got. A little bit. There ain't a lot there anymore, but yes. So thank you for noticing, Amber. I appreciate it. All right, let's jump into the topic, the Ukrainian church. So, Father, the first question I have for you is, what was it about the Ukrainian church in general? So to, I guess, to give a little bit of background, I alluded to this a little bit earlier. I saw you made a post on Twitter. You tagged me in it along with other people, and paraphrasing what you said, correct me if I'm wrong, but basically YouTubers and specifically Orthodox Christians with platforms on YouTube ought to do some research and do shows about the Ukrainian Orthodox Church, or at least a show. And I was willing to collab with everybody you tagged in that. I didn't see any feedback. Was there any feedback received on your end?
I didn't get anybody saying, "Hey, I'd like to be on a big show."
Okay.
What I was asking for, and doing full length shows like we're doing, I think is even better. But especially, I was hoping to get people to make short videos that just said, "Hey, we object to our tax dollars going to support the persecution of the canonical church in Ukraine," and then using that hashtag. But we can do a 2-hour video and use the hashtag too, so that's fine.
Let's do it.
And the thing is, the situation in Ukraine is complicated, and there's a lot of history to it. You might recall when Tucker Carlson interviewed Putin that Putin spent about an hour giving him a 5-minute explanation of Russian history. I won't spend quite that much time, but the reason why it's in the news right now is that Ukraine has just passed a bill banning the canonical Orthodox Church. But to understand why we are at this point and what the background is, let me just give a little bit of the history.
Yeah.
The Russian Orthodox Church really had its beginnings when Saint Vladimir converted to Orthodox Christianity, and then the Rus, as the people who lived in Kiev at that time were called, were baptized in the Dnieper River, and so that was the beginning. There were already Orthodox Christians among the Rus before that, but that was when it became the official religion, and most of the people embraced it. And so at that time, the land of the Rus was, pretty much where you see Ukraine is today, but it was already starting to spread to the north. And so you had Saint Alexander Nevsky was related to Saint Vladimir, and he defended Orthodoxy from the invasion of the Teutonic Knights at the Battle of on the Neva River in the winter, which is where he got the name Nevsky. But that's already, the center of gravity was already moving to the north. But what happened? You had this. The Rus were really Vikings that came and settled into Slavic lands, and according to the Russian chronicles, the local people the Slavic people were saying, "Hey, come rule over us because we can't manage our own affairs." And I'm not sure if that's actually how it happened, but in any case, the Vikings wound up establishing themselves as the rulers of this area. But they quickly intermarried with the Slavs, and you can tell by the names, because I think their first ruler was named Rurik. But by the time you get to Vladimir is a Slavic name. So they became integrated with the locals. And
sorry, do you mind just giving a date stamp just for context as well? What kind of date are we dealing with around here?
Well, 988 is when they converted to Orthodoxy, but I think that the Rurik dynasty was established in what's now Ukraine, probably about maybe 80 years prior to that, so sometime in the early 900s.
Okay.
And one thing that's interesting is the Feast of the Protection, which is observed on October the 1st on the church calendar. So if you're on the new calendar, it would still be on October the 1st, but for most of the Russians, it would be October the 14th.
Okay.
It commemorates when Constantinople was miraculously delivered from the invasion of barbarians. But the barbarians who were invading were actually the Rus, who had not yet converted to Christianity. And what's interesting is the Greeks can commemorate this as sort of a minor feast, whereas the Russians, actually, it's almost like a great feast. So the people who were defeated celebrated as a bigger deal than the people who got delivered. But in any case, the story goes that Saint Vladimir, at a certain point, his grandmother actually was already a Christian, but he was raised as a pagan. He had many wives. He was a very violent, Viking pagan ruler. But at a certain point, he decided he needed to embrace a monotheistic religion because he saw that all the great empires were monotheists. And the story is that he sent envoys and had envoys from different groups that were trying to get him to adopt their religion. And the story, it goes that when the Jews sent their representatives, Saint Vladimir asked them, "So where is your kingdom?" And he said, "Well, God got angry with us and he took our kingdom away." And he said, "Well, I don't want to adopt your religion because God might get angry with me and take my kingdom away." And then the Muslims came to him, and he liked the thing about having at least 4 wives because he had more than that, and he wanted to keep as many of them as he could. But when they said that the prophet forbids alcohol, he said, "Oh no,
No way.
Wine is the joy of the Rus." And at that time, of course, the West was still part of the same church, but you had Latin missionaries that came to him, and he thought that their faith seemed very austere. But then he sent envoys to Constantinople, and the famous report that they give back to him was, "We didn't know whether we were in heaven or on earth because it was so beautiful." And he decided to adopt the Orthodox Christian faith, and he embraced it very sincerely. And so what happened was, within maybe 100 years or so, the Mongols or the Tartars, I can't remember which, invaded and devastated the Rus. As a matter of fact, we're hearing about Kursk right now because of the war, but the Kursk icon, which is a miraculous icon that the Russian Church abroad actually has in its possession, was found at the root of a tree, because this whole area, the whole area of Kursk, was so devastated that very few people lived there, and a hunter found it at the foot of a tree, and
Oh, wow.
the icon was recognized as being miraculous, and as history went on, it became very important in the history of the Russian Church. But the Russians that lived further to the north were less affected by this invasion, because when you invade, you want to go to the most prosperous areas, and the area that's now Ukraine was a very fertile area. There was a lot to steal, and so they devastated this area. As history unfolded, the Poles at one time controlled much of Ukraine, and for a period of time, well, I should say the Russian Church was actually under Constantinople up until the time of the fall of Constantinople, or actually it was just before that, when the Council of Florence happened and Constantinople went into a false union with Rome because the emperor was trying to get the West to send troops to help him fight off the Ottoman Turks. And when the Metropolitan, who was a Greek, came back to Kiev and told them that they were in union with Rome, the people rejected that, and Russia became de facto independent because they refused to go along with that. Well, after the fall of Constantinople, and you had Orthodox bishops of Constantinople that were put back on the throne, the Patriarchate of Constantinople, along with the other ancient patriarchs, recognized the Church of Russia as a autocephalous church.
Now we're talking just real quick, Father. So now we're fast forward about 1600s. Is that right?
Sometime around then, yeah.
Okay.
And
1453 was the fall of Constantinople.
Right.
Okay.
So
and just before you go on, just to clarify, so I'm following. So I'm assuming the Ukrainian Orthodox Church is not today a part of the proper Orthodox Church, but up to 1453, it is a recognized part of the Orthodox Church proper. Is that correct?
Well, it depends on which Ukrainian church you're talking about, which we'll get to. But basically, the Ukrainian church as a whole has always been part of the Orthodox Church since it converted to the faith. It's just there was a period of time at the beginning when all the Russians were under Constantinople.
Okay.
And then Russia proper became autocephalous. But at that time, much, but not all of Ukraine was actually not under Russian control. And so the Patriarch of Constantinople was still in charge over the areas that were under the Poles. It gets a bit complicated because the lines of history have changed a lot. And as I was talking to you all about it before we started the stream, the very word Ukraine means border region. And the border shifted many times over history. So the Ukraine that you see on the map today is not the Ukraine that was on the map even at the time of the Bolshevik Revolution. Ukraine was much smaller. But Lenin added areas to Ukraine, and then Khrushchev added Crimea. And so, and also Stalin added some areas that had been controlled by either Poland or Hungary or Romania. And so Ukraine, it's been described by some historians as basically the remains of many empires that have come and gone. And that's one of the reasons why it's a divided country, is because not everybody in Ukraine comes from the same background. If you come from Western Ukraine, you come up from a very different perspective and also a history than people in Eastern Ukraine who for most of their history thought of themselves as Russians and were part of Russia. And so it gets very complicated. But as time went on, especially under Catherine the Great, the Russians reconquered Ukraine. And so the Patriarch of Constantinople recognized Moscow as having control over that church, although most recently, like in 2018, Constantinople suddenly decided that they didn't agree with that. But for the last several centuries, everyone recognized Ukraine as part of the Russian church. And in Ukraine, if you go to the West, like I said, there are people who actually have traditionally spoken what's called Ukrainian. And it's very similar to Russian. As a matter of fact, a Russian and a Ukrainian who didn't know, most Ukrainians know Russian, but if you were a Ukrainian that's only spoke Ukrainian, you didn't know Russian, and you were speaking to a Russian who didn't speak Ukrainian, you would still be able to understand each other on some level. It's just that some of the subtleties you would miss. Because some words mean different things in the different languages, but we're really talking about dialects more so than different languages.
Right.
But a big chunk of Ukraine, the people have always spoken Russian. Vladimir Zelensky, as a matter of fact, grew up speaking Russian. Now he acts like he doesn't understand it, and he speaks through a Ukrainian interpreter, but it's ridiculous because that's his native language. So unless he, has had brain surgery and forgotten how to speak the language he spoke most of his life, he still understands Russian. He just pretends that he doesn't.
Wow.
But anyway, in the Western Ukraine, you had people who tended to be more nationalistic. They wanted an independent Ukraine, and in the east and the south of Ukraine, they were less inclined in that direction. When the Soviet Union collapsed, there was by that time, Ukraine was as it was under the Soviets, and the Soviet Constitution made it easy for some reason for Soviet republics to secede. I don't know why the Soviets did that, but that enabled the biggest peaceful, at that time at least, secession in the history of the world. You had all these Soviet satellite republics that seceded from the Soviet Union, and there was no bloodshed in most cases, and even in those cases where there was some bloodshed, it was very little. And Ukraine voted; they had votes, and they voted to become independent, although the vote was not an overwhelming vote. And then, since the collapse of the Soviet Union, America has actually launched two color revolutions. There was the Orange Revolution, where we installed somebody to our liking, and but then within a couple of election cycles, it wound up reverting to people who were pro-Russian. And when you look at the election maps, you can see that Eastern Ukraine and Southern Ukraine voted for the pro-Russian party, and Western Ukraine tended to vote for the pro-Ukrainian independence and pro-European Union party. Well, in 2014, we launched another coup, the Maidan Revolution, as it's sometimes called. And the United States was 100% behind it. We have recordings of Victoria Nuland picking the new government. As a matter of fact, almost certainly the Russians tapped the line and released the recording, but no one's ever denied that the recording's authentic. And there's a really good documentary by Oliver Stone called Ukraine on Fire, where they document what happened. But I should say that when Ukraine became independent, the Metropolitan of Kiev at that time he thought that he was going to be elected Patriarch of Moscow, and under the Soviets he probably would have been, because he was very friendly with the Soviets, and he was also very anti-Ukrainian or Ukrainian independence for that matter. There's a documentary on Rumble that I watched recently, and I've heard this quote from him before. At that time, he was saying Ukrainian is not even a real language; it's just a mixture of Polish and what he called Żydowski, which is Jewish, dialect. So he ridiculed Ukrainian as a legitimate language, and but then when he wasn't elected Patriarch of Moscow, he decided he wanted to establish his own autocephalous church in Ukraine and become the Patriarch of Kiev. Well, he wound up being thwarted and being eventually excommunicated, defrocked, and then eventually anathematized by the Russian Church, because he he established his own independent, non-canonical church, which he called the Kievan Patriarchate.
Wow.
And nobody recognized them as legitimate. No local church recognized them as legitimate. As a matter of fact, twice he appealed to Constantinople, as if Constantinople had the right to hear such an appeal, which is really not true under the canons. But twice Constantinople replied and said, this is a matter for the Russian Church, and they're competent to make this decision. Fast forward, and you have the Maidan Revolution, and then you have the Council of Crete. Well, the Council of Crete, Constantinople was very anxious to have everybody participate and declare it to be a new ecumenical council. For various reasons, the Russians wound up not coming. Basically, the Russian attitude from the very beginning was that the Council of Crete, for it to be accepted by everybody and not be a divisive issue, needed to have the participation of everybody. So all the local churches needed to be present. And also, the Russian Church wanted everything to be done by unanimous consent, rather than to have it be shoved down anybody's throat. Well, by the time the council was getting ready to happen, Antioch said they weren't going to come because they were having a dispute with the Jerusalem Patriarchate, and Bulgaria, and I think maybe the Georgian Church, I can't remember, I know for Bulgaria for sure, had said they're not going to come because they weren't happy with some of the documents that were being proposed. So the Russian Church asked Constantinople to postpone the council until we could hammer out whatever the the disagreements were. But Constantinople went ahead and held the council anyway, and the Russian Church didn't come. So there's a lot of reason to believe that Constantinople was inclined to get some sort of revenge on the Russian Church. I'm not sure if that's really true, but that's at least been speculated. And there also was a gathering of all the heads of the autocephalous churches, and the subject of Ukraine was brought up. And the Patriarch of Serbia later mentioned this at the time that the ecumenical patriarch recognized the schismatics, he reminded publicly in an open letter that Patriarch Bartholomew had assured all the other heads of the local churches that he would not interfere in the affairs of the Ukrainian church.
Wow.
Well, if you look at the orthodoxhistory.org website and you put CIA EP into the search,
yeah,
you will find that beginning during World War II and certainly after World War II, the ecumenical patriarchate became very dependent on the United States because, unfortunately, since the fall of Constantinople, the ecumenical patriarchate has been in a very difficult situation under the Turks. And then after World War I, they were in even a more difficult situation. And then the Turks basically expelled almost all the Greeks out of Turkey. So the Constantinople was left with almost nobody left in their flock.
Yeah.
And so then they started trying to amass foreign territories to themselves because they didn't have any people. They didn't have any income stream hardly because of what had happened. And they were very dependent. Prior to World War II, they were very dependent on the British. So the British would use their influence on the Turks to get the Turks to not just kick them all out or kill them. And during World War II, that shifted, like a lot of things did, between the British Empire to the United States Empire, essentially.
Right. I was going to say there's a lot, like just worldwide after World War II, a lot of things shifted. Dale, I know you was trying to jump in real quick. Go ahead.
Yeah. So I just had a quick clarifying question about something you said a while back. So it's interesting. So the Ukraine, they can't go to Constantinople for approval or anything because it's not a centralized thing, but it's the Russia, whoever the head of the Russian Orthodox Church, they have the
right.
So I'm just kind of curious, in the Orthodox Church, how do you guys split that up? Like, why can you divide it down to Russia, but like, why can't Ukraine split off in the same way the Russian Orthodox has split off from the Constantinople Church and authority? Why can't how would the Ukraine go about separating and have, and now it's the Ukraine Orthodox Church, it's up to that.
Well, the Russian Church would not have unilaterally separated from Constantinople had Constantinople not gone into a false union with Rome. So they had a theological reason for separating themselves from Constantinople. And then also Russia was a rising power. And I think after the fall of Constantinople, even the ecumenical patriarchate began to look to the Russian czars as the new Christian empire. And the Russians saw themselves as a continuation of the Christian Roman Empire. And throughout Russia's history, prior to the Bolshevik Revolution, the czars did use their power to protect the interests of Christians that were under the Turks. So there were many cases where the Turks would start persecuting Christians, and then a Russian gunboat would show up off the coast of wherever this was happening, and the Russians would inform them, you better cut that out, or you're going to find out, the hard way that we don't approve of that. And so anyway, it's a long history. But at the time when all this happened, you had this schism in the Ukrainian church, although it was a small one, relatively speaking, but it was not unsubstantial. I mean, there were parishes that were established by the Kievan Patriarchate. But as like I said, nobody recognized them. But the Russian church, recognizing that there were a lot of people in Ukraine that wanted an independent church, but there were also a lot of people who wanted to maintain their ties with the Russian church. They decided to split the difference, and they gave them autonomy. And they gave them autonomy that was extremely broad. Essentially, Ukraine has had more influence on the Russian church than the Russian church has had on the Ukrainian church. And the reason why this is the only thing that Ukraine has had to ask Russia for permission to do is whenever they've had to elect a new primate, they submit the name of the bishop they elected to be the new Metropolitan of Kiev to the Holy Synod, on which they have a representative. And they've never been turned down. And the Russian church would never turn them down unless it was an outrageous candidate, because the Russian church would know that they would be tempting the people to push for independence completely if they showed any signs of trying to interfere in the affairs of the Russian church. So the Russian church did not sit on the councils of Ukraine. The Ukrainian church had the power to canonize their own saints, basically manage their own affairs. And when the Russian church held a council, unlike when Ukraine held a council, all the bishops of Ukraine were invited to participate in that council. So, and the number of bishops in Ukraine is not an unsubstantial number of bishops. Aside from that, it's also true that many of the clergy and many of the bishops in Russia proper are also Ukrainian, because for various reasons, the way that the Soviet Union unfolded, there was less devastation of the churches in Ukraine than there was in Russia proper. Russia got the brunt of the Bolshevik terror right at the very beginning of it, where they were just blowing up churches right and left. And so there were many villages and even cities in Russia where there were no churches when the Soviet Union collapsed. There was not even one that was functioning. Whereas in Ukraine, that was a lot less common. I don't think there might not have been any that were like that. And so the church was stronger in Ukraine than it was in Russia per capita. So Ukrainians have always had an outsized influence just in terms of the number of bishops and clergy that they exported to the rest of the church. And that's even true in the Russian church abroad. The Russian church abroad was actually established largely by Ukrainians. Our monastery in Jordanville, New York, which is like the flagship of the Russian church abroad, the monastic brotherhood is called the Brotherhood of St. Job of Pachayev. Pachayev is in western Ukraine, and the reason why that is because the monks that established the monastery in Jordanville were from the Pachayev Lavra. So there are very strong connections with Ukraine and the Russian church abroad, but also, like I said, throughout Russia, you find Ukrainians everywhere. So the Ukrainians got to vote whenever the Russians held a council, and so they had much more influence on Russia than Russia had over Ukraine. Well, anyway, fast forward it to about 2018. Well, there's different speculation about what motivated this, but the United States State Department 100% pushed the ecumenical patriarch to recognize a schismatic church in Ukraine. How they did that, what pressure they used, I would say is a matter of speculation. I'm not even going to get into that because I don't want to be accused of just trading in rumors, but they had the pull and they did it, even despite the fact that Patriarch Bartholomew had encouraged, he had repeatedly said he would never do what he wound up doing. So basically, he had the schismatics hold a council in Kiev that was sponsored by Poroshenko, who was the president of Ukraine at the time. This is after the Maidan coup. And they were given a tomos of autocephaly by the ecumenical patriarch, and they elected their own metropolitan, who is Epiphany, as I call him, or Epiphany Dominko, who was never consecrated as a bishop by a canonical bishop. So he's a layman who's parading as a metropolitan. And they invited all the bishops of the canonical Ukrainian church to come, and I believe only one did come. And he was very much on the far left of the spectrum of the Ukrainian church. Metropolitan Onufry is the head of the canonical Ukrainian Orthodox Church, and by all accounts, he's an extremely pious man, and many people consider him to be a living saint. And so very few clergy went over to the schismatic group, only one bishop, and despite the fact that there was increasing pressure, and even before Russia sent its military in full force into Ukraine in February of 2022, they were already stealing churches from the canonical church, and they were persecuting the canonical church. Now,
can I just jump in?
Sure, go ahead.
I don't want to interrupt, kind of thing, but okay, so kind of, I just wanted to follow up on the last question. So you kind of answered there were those unique circumstances, and that's why the Russian church is in terms of authority, it's kind of separated. But I'm kind of curious in terms of the general process, because I'm assuming it's not just Russia. Like Constantinople doesn't have to answer to Russia. I know Tyler's a part of he's not a part of the Greek Orthodox. He's a part of the Antiochian Orthodox. So
good job, Dale. Proud of you.
So my first question, I learned something eventually. How many separate centers of authority, for lack of a better word, are there within Orthodoxy proper? And like, is there a general process? Like, apart from unique historical situations, like, what are the rules if you want to become a separate sect or branch or something?
Well, for one thing, all the autocephalous churches and the Orthodox Church are all in communion with each other, so they're not really a distinct church. It's just they're governed separately. And after the fall of Constantinople, and then as many of these parts of Europe that were under Ottoman control became independent again, you had the recognition of these churches as autocephalous churches, although Bulgaria had been an autocephalous church before they were conquered by the Ottoman Turks, as had Serbia. And I'm not sure about Romania, but maybe them too. But what happened was when the Turks conquered these countries, they forced all those bishops to be under Constantinople, because in the Turkish system, the way they ruled conquered people was they established an ethnarch for those people. And the Patriarch of Constantinople was declared to be the ethnarch of the Rum Millet. Rum Millet meaning the Roman ethnic group, because the Christians in the Byzantine Empire thought of themselves as Romans. And because the Serbs, the Romanians, the Bulgarians were all also under, they were Orthodox Christians, they were put under that authority. And ethnarch means ethnic ruler, basically, is what that means. So when those countries became independent again, Constantinople and other patriarchates recognized them as independent. Now, in the case of Ukraine, let's give a hypothetical different scenario. Let's say Metropolitan Onufry had petitioned Constantinople to give him an autocephaly, and Russia said, well, you can't do that. It would at least have had some veneer of legitimacy, because it would have been the canonical head of the autonomous Ukrainian church making the request, instead of the secular post-coup U.S.-backed regime with the State Department's help pushing for an autocephalous church. And had Metropolitan Onufry petitioned for an autocephaly, let's say the other local churches agreed, hey, that should be a local church, it should be autocephalous, Russia might not like it, but ultimately it would probably have to accept it at some point. It might not accept it for a while, but it would probably have been forced to accept it. But Metropolitan Onufry didn't petition for that. He didn't ask for it, and he certainly didn't want to do it under the conditions of the state trying to force something into existence and force the canonical church to accept these schismatics without any repentance on their part. So, go ahead.
I was just going to say thank you for your answer, but yeah, if you're not done, so autocephalys is the technical thing that I need to look at.
Yeah, autocephaly means self-heading, and autonomous means self-governing. So that's different, because if you're autonomous, you still have some ties to the mother church, but you mostly manage your own affairs.
Can I ask a clarifying question too? So what's interesting is I just got done recording, so shameless plug first and foremost. This book in an audiobook version, I am not, so all the recording is done and I am just now editing it, and I'm supposed to get it to Craig by September the 1st. Please pray for me, because that's going to be a tight squeeze as of right now. There was something that came up today, and my daughter has to, and please pray for my daughter. She has to get tested for autism tomorrow. That's something that's going to be interesting. So anyway, so it's going to be a tight deadline is the point I'm trying to make. But this subject is kind of what I'm thinking of, because I just got done recording Craig's book, The Rise and Fall of the Papacy. Whenever we think back to the early church, we don't see a centralized figure, right? As primacy, I think, would be relative, first among equals, right? But not supremacy. And so this is the difference between papal primacy or Rome's primacy versus Rome's primacy, versus Rome's supremacy. And so in one of Craig's chapters, I forget, but he mentions the pentarchy. So the 5 C's. We have Constantinople, Rome, Jerusalem, Antioch, and Alexandria. And would those churches, Father, be considered autocephalous or autonomous?
They would all be autocephalous.
Autocephalous, okay.
And interestingly, when Russia was given autocephaly by the 4 remaining patriarchs, it was declared to be 5th in the diptychs. So it basically took Rome's place, but not the first position. Constantinople took the first position.
Right.
Moscow took the 5th position, but it became one of the 5 first patriarchs.
So to that point, then, this is the way the church until, and Craig really brings this out great in his book, the 11th century, there's some seeds in the 9th, but in the 11th century is whenever we don't get a full papal Roman supremacy ideology, right, by Anastasius. And so this is the way the church has always operated, and the way you're describing the Orthodox Church operating, autocephalous and autonomous. Is that right?
Right.
Okay.
And basically to justify their position in Ukraine, that the ecumenical patriarchate and their mouthpieces have started to develop what you can only describe as a neo-papist ecclesiology.
Yeah.
Where they, for example, Archbishop Elpidiphorus of the gay baptism fame wrote an essay in which he declared that the ecumenical patriarchate was not the first among equals, he was the first without equals, which is something that even Rome never said.
Yeah.
And so the unfortunate thing is you have to feel sympathy for the ecumenical patriarchate, because historically it's been an extremely difficult situation since the fall of Constantinople. It's been constantly under pressure.
Sure.
And it's been largely just trying to find some way to survive. And especially after all the Greeks, except for about a couple thousand people in Constantinople, were kicked out of Turkey. They've been incredibly weak, and there's just so many things that the 20th century was a very tumultuous period in church history.
Yeah.
And one thing that's very interesting about what's going on now compared to what happened in the 20th century is back when the ecumenical patriarchate was still under sort of the patronage of the British, you had a patriarch called Meletios Metaxakis, who had a very colorful, in a bad way, career. He was actually defrocked by the Church of Greece because he became the Archbishop of North America, which at that time was under the Church of Greece, not under the ecumenical patriarchate. And he was wearing his mantia, and he kissed the holy table of an Episcopal church. And so the Church of Greece defrocked him for this violation of good church order.
Yeah.
But then he was elected as Patriarch of Constantinople, some say through the influence of the British. And he was a Mason, and he was very ecumenistic. And he was the one that actually introduced the new calendar in the Orthodox Church. And he also had an agenda that was very renovationistic and more modernistic. He wanted to have married bishops, shorten the fast, shorten the services, a whole array of reforms that would basically make the Orthodox Church a lot more like the Church of England,
right?
Than the Orthodox Church.
Yeah.
Well, not long after the introduction of the new calendar, he was actually run out of Constantinople on a rail because the people that were under him reacted so badly against what he had done.
Yeah.
And then the British used their influence to get him elected as Patriarch of Alexandria, and he introduced the new calendar there because Alexandria had actually not participated in the council that adopted the new calendar and rejected it. But he became the Patriarch of Alexandria, and he introduced the new calendar there.
Talk about jurisdiction hopping.
Yep. Well, his successor actually went into communion with the Living Church in Russia. And to understand the Living Church, prior to the revolution, you had people who were liberals under the Russian Empire in the church, but they kept it very quiet because the czars had no sympathy with that sort of thing. Well, when the communists took over, all these people came out of the closet, and they were trying to. They wanted to follow the same renovationist agenda that was introduced at the council by Miletus Metaxakis, and the Soviet Union wound up recognizing them as the only legitimate Orthodox church in Russia. And Constantinople and Alexandria went into communion with that schismatic group. Mm-hmm. So what happened in the 1920s and 30s is almost an exact repeat of what's happening in Ukraine right now, where the ecumenical patriarchate went into communion with schismatics because of outside influence and also to bolster their own position. And the only reason why they stopped being in commune with the living church is the living church died. The last bishop of the living church died in like 1946, but it was pretty much dead actually before that. And so the ecumenical patriarchates after that pretty much just forgot that they went into communion with this group. And the Russian church was still under persecution, although less so in the Soviet Union. And so they just wanted any outside support they could get. So they let bygones be bygones and didn't hold the ecumenical patriarchate to any kind of account for the fact that they were actually helping to facilitate the persecution of the Orthodox Christians in the Soviet Union. You had millions of people who were killed who were Orthodox Christians at the hands of the Soviets, hundreds of bishops, thousands of priests, more thousands of nuns and monks, slaughtered, tortured to death, put into prison camps. That all happened with the help of the ecumenical patriarchate.
Wow.
Well, after the collapse of the Soviet Union, you have all the stuff that I've already talked about. And then after the Maidan revolutions, quote unquote, there was already a civil war going on in Ukraine. Russia seized Crimea because Crimea had been part of Russia proper until the 1950s when Khrushchev gave it as a gift to Ukraine. And that was where the Black Sea Fleet was based. And Russia, when they saw that the United States had overthrown the constitutionally and legitimately elected government of Ukraine, just decided we're taking Crimea, because most people in Crimea thought of themselves as Russians. They held a referendum. Something like 90% of the people voted in favor of joining Russia. But in eastern Ukraine, you had the Donbass or the Donetsk People's Republic, as they declared themselves, and the Lugansk People's Republic, that revolted against the post-coup government in Ukraine. And there was a civil war going on from 2014 up until 2022. So 8 years of war. And Russia had two attempts to try to negotiate a peace, the Minsk Accord 1 and the Minsk Accord 2. And after they invaded in February of 2022, the German former president Angela Merkel said those treaties were just a stall for time so we could arm Ukraine. So we came out publicly and said we had no legitimate interest in actually negotiating a peaceful resolution to the civil war. And ethnic Russian people were being killed, women and children being shelled, and Russia wanted to stop it. They were not trying to carve these parts of Ukraine off. They were not going to give Crimea back, but they were not trying to take these places. But what happened is after Biden took office, Zelensky started talking about joining NATO and also talking about acquiring nuclear weapons. And back in, I believe it was 2021, Russia made an ultimatum to NATO and the United States in particular, and said, look, either you're going to promise that NATO is not moving into Ukraine and you're going to assure that they're not going to acquire nuclear weapons or else is going to happen. Well, the United States basically said, pound sand, we don't care, do whatever you want to do.
Right.
And that's how the war heated up in 2022, unfortunately. And something north of 500,000 Ukrainian soldiers are now dead. Probably hundreds of thousands are wounded, maimed for life, not to mention the civilians that have been killed, and not to mention the Russian soldiers that have been killed and maimed. for the rest of their life. So it's just a catastrophe which totally could have been avoided. But our government, the United States government, made that happen because they refused to negotiate in good faith. And they wanted to keep pushing NATO all the way to the Russian border, despite the fact that we had promised Gorbachev way back when the Soviet Union withdrew troops from Eastern Germany, Poland, and all the other parts of the Eastern Bloc. We had promised Gorbachev that we would not move NATO 1 inch past East Germany, because when Germany reunited, West Germany was already part of NATO. So that would, if the Soviet Union allowed them to unite, that de facto meant that NATO's borders moved further to the east. But we promised them not an inch further. And of course, subsequent presidents blew that off, and NATO eventually moved into the Baltic states, Poland, all the Eastern Bloc countries, essentially. And Russia basically said, thus far, no farther. And we basically said, we're going to keep pushing. And I think that it's quite possible that our government actually wanted Russia to invade because they wanted to be able to blame the hyperinflation that was happening in our country on Russia. And maybe they wanted us to get into a hot war for their own reasons. I don't know, but they seem to have been very intent in the last year and a half to get us into a war somewhere, whether it was with Iran, China, or Russia. It didn't seem to matter. Just they wanted a war with somebody. Well, I'm not saying Putin should have done it. I'm not defending what Putin did. I know that when I talk to Ukrainians, I find Ukrainians all over the map. I can certainly understand why a lot of Ukrainians would say Russia shouldn't have done that. My village has been destroyed. My relatives have been killed in the fighting. It's just horrible. But it all could have been avoided. I don't know what Putin's responsibility is before God. I know what our government's responsibility is they 100% could have stopped it, and they chose not to. And that's just evil.
Well, and you see that. So I rarely bring up politics on the show, but you see that. I see that in real time, because guess what? We had 4 years, and I described this on my Facebook profile, like I think it was last week sometime. I remember the last 8 years of my life, right? And I know those 4 years with Trump, you had the Abrahamic Accords happening in the Middle East, let alone Russia and Ukraine not battling it out. And then what happens? Well, the United States flips blue, and all of a sudden, everything changes. Like the way and this is just, I'm not trying to get too political, but this is just from personal experience. Like our life has literally been flipped upside down, let alone starting wars. Now you've got Israel, Gaza, and Ukraine and Russia, and things are heating up in Iran. And it's like
China.
And China. Yep. You had none of that with Trump. And so I hear what you're saying, Father. Yeah. And believe it, obviously.
And the thing is, our military is so hollowed out because, for one thing, under Biden, they were pushing the vaccine mandates by which they ran out most of the conservatives who were still in the military.
Yeah.
And they targeted Christians to run them out. And now they're begging for them to come back because they think we're getting ready to get into a war. Well, you know what? There's a lot of people who would have signed up in a heartbeat to fight for America that right now are not going to do it. Mm-hmm. And it's sad, but we don't have the military to fight Russia, Iran, or China, not to mention all three of them at the same time. So our behavior has just been absolutely insane. We don't have the military we had back in 1990, and Russia's not as weak now as it was back in 1990. So we're not going to be able to get away with the kind of stuff that we used to get away with in the past. And it's just a catastrophe. But getting back to the church and how the church ties into all this, well, when Russia sent its troops in, they obviously began to occupy certain parts of Ukraine. So the Ukrainian church in those areas has been protected. But the Ukrainian church in those areas still controlled by the Ukrainian government began to experience very much increased persecution. And you can watch videos of this, but they developed this routine of getting a rent-a-mob to show up at a local parish and basically take over the church. And they usually will hold some sort of a fake election where a bunch of people who never go to that church will vote and say, we vote to go over to the Ukrainian church, the Orthodox Church of Ukraine, OKU, which is the schismatic church.
Sounds like our election cycle last year.
Well, yeah. And then what happens is, the thing is, the schismatics don't have the people.
God.
They are a joke.
Yeah.
And so what happens is when they seize these churches, they almost invariably wind up padlocking the doors, and then there's nobody in the church. They do have services in some places, but not the kind of numbers that the legitimate church was having.
Right.
And Epiphany, when he serves at the Kiev Caves Lavra, they have to bus in people from all over Ukraine to try to get a respectable crowd. And even then, you still see that it's very light. Whereas when Metropolitan Onufry serves anywhere, the church is packed.
Yeah.
When they hold a procession, the streets are packed. When this fake church first got their so-called autocephaly, they tried to do a St. Vladimir's Day procession through Kiev to rival the canonical church. And they got a bunch of government employees out there and everything, but it was still pitiful by comparison. So they stopped trying to do that because it was just too embarrassing for them to do it. But one thing I forgot to say about the so-called autocephaly that they got is Ukraine now cannot glorify, the fake church cannot glorify their own saints without the approval of Constantinople. They can't elect new bishops without the approval of Constantinople. They can't elect a new primate without Constantinople. They get their chrism from Constantinople. So basically, they're not autocephalous because autocephalous means something. Autocephalous means you don't have to get anything from anybody.
Right.
But they don't have autocephaly. They have limited autonomy. The Russian Church abroad probably has more autonomy from the Moscow Patriarchate than these people have from Constantinople.
Wow.
And the people just have not gone along with them, and the clergy and the bishops have not gone along with them, despite the fact that they're really, in many cases, being tortured. They're having their churches taken. There have been pitiful scenes. You can watch videos of this on YouTube, particularly if you go to the Union of Orthodox Journalists channel on YouTube. For example, there was a mother whose son had died fighting for Ukraine in this war.
Mm-hmm.
And the schismatics were seizing the church, and she was on her knees begging them to let her son have his funeral before they would take it over. And they didn't do it. That's how heartless these people are. And they don't even have enough monks in the entire world to man the Kiev Caves Lavra, and yet they're trying to seize it and take it away from the legitimate church. They thought that if they kept putting the screws to the canonical church, that people would start caving and then they would start coming over to the fake church, and it has not happened. Despite the fact that people have literally been killed, and many bishops and clergy are in prison right now, facing trial and possibly prison sentences of decades. They're still refusing to go along with this. And so basically we have a new period of martyrdom. The persecution is not at the same level as like the worst of the Soviet persecution, but it's far worse than the Soviets were persecuting the church, say, in the last 50 years of the history of the Soviet Union.
Yeah. I'm kind of curious. You mentioned about the numbers. I know it was a while back now, but the numbers of the schisms here, like the numbers are very low. They even have to engage in fraudulent things like bringing people from all around to try and fill the pews. So I'm kind of curious, if that wasn't the case, let's say the majority of the Ukrainian Orthodox Christians there were showing up, would that be like a problem or like a falsification in some way of orthodoxy, or could that be explained as well?
Well, the thing is, if you let's say you had something like 95% of the faithful of Ukraine that were supporting the schismatic church, at some point probably they would get some kind of recognition, because that would be a reality on the ground that people wouldn't be able to ignore. There's a parallel example of this in the Macedonian church. The Macedonians, I believe they speak something like Bulgarian, but they were part of the Serbian Orthodox Church. But when Macedonia became an independent republic, they established a breakaway church which no one recognized. But like in the last year, the Serbian church actually decided to go ahead, recognize that church, come to terms with them, and gave them autocephaly. So that church was eventually recognized as being legitimate, although for many years they were not. But in this case, that's not what's happening in Ukraine. Now, there are lots of Ukrainians that will say, hey, I support the church under Epiphany. But these are people who don't go to church. Who cares what people who don't go to church think about what the church ought to do? It's only the people who actually show up for church on a regular basis that anyone should be concerned with in terms of what their opinion is. And those people don't support the fake church.
Right. Gotcha. Yeah, thanks.
And with this new law that was just passed and signed by Zelensky, they actually gave a 9-month transition period. So they're actually not effectively declaring the canonical church illegal yet. But they're saying 9 months from the day this bill went into effect, they will be illegal if they don't come under either the fake church, or they've also floated this idea of Metropolitan Onufri coming under Constantinople. Which, why would he do that when Constantinople's the one that stabbed him in the back already? It's not going to happen.
Right.
But I'll tell you why they're doing a 9-month transition period, and it's the U.S. election. And it's because they already know that if Trump wins, J.D. Vance has made a public statement condemning their persecution of the canonical Orthodox Church. They already know that Trump is not going to be on board with this. Mm-hmm. But they know that if Kamala Harris gets elected, that they'll be able to get away with it.
Well, that's why they're getting away with it now.
Exactly.
And so why wouldn't they continue? I mean, people tend to forget, and again, not trying to get political, but people tend to forget that Kamala Harris is your vice president right now. She's been the vice president for the last 4 years. So why would anybody want to vote for her? Do you like suffering like we are today? Do you like seeing people get killed over in other countries? This didn't happen under Trump, y'all. Sorry. Not trying to get excited,
but statement, but I will just say that it's a fact that Ukraine has openly stated that they know that if Trump gets in there, it's going to change things in terms of their persecution of the Ukrainian Orthodox Church.
Yeah.
And so some people might want to weigh that on election day.
No, I agree. And you don't have to agree with all of Trump's policies. I sure don't, right? But why would I vote? Like, again, all you have to do is look at the past 4 years and then look at the 4 years before that. Like, right. Were you better off personally? Just a personal thing. Like, don't they be selfish in this, right? And I don't say that like as a practice, but it's super simple, y'all. Like, my family, were personally better off. It seemed like the world at large was better off. And the only thing that was keeping people fighting about Trump and not liking Trump is Twitter posts. That says something to me, right? I don't like Kamala Harris and Biden for their policies, not for Twitter posts. Anyway.
Well, the thing is, I can understand why someone might object to Trump personally.
Well, yeah.
The only thing I would say, though, is that when it comes to my vote, if I'm going to give a vote to a politician, I want them to give me something. And I'm not going to name names on your YouTube channel, but I have a representative locally.
Yeah.
Who I don't think he's giving me anything. And so on election day, as things stand right now, my intention is to leave that slot blank. I'm not going to vote for his opponent, but I'm not going to vote for him.
Right.
And I want him to, I'm hoping that he'll start seeing, hey, there's a bunch of undervotes in my category on the ballot. Why is that?
Yeah.
So you're never going to get everything you want from a candidate unless you're voting for yourself. But you ought to be getting something. And if they're not giving you anything, they ought to not get your vote.
Exactly.
So I have no problems being political. Vote Trump or you're insane. Sorry. On a serious note, you're either deeply ignorant or literally insane.
Wait, Dale, hold on. Is this Faith Unaltered's official endorsement of Trump?
It's my official endorsement. I'm pretty sure David Russell would agree. I know you agree, obviously.
All right, this is the faith portion of Faith Unaltered's official endorsement of Trump. How about that?
Well, Robert Kennedy, when he gave his speech endorsing Trump, he actually mentioned the situation in Ukraine, and he mentioned the persecution of the Ukrainian church.
Yeah.
And I'll tell you what, had the Republicans nominated Nikki Haley and Robert Kennedy Jr. was still on the ballot, even though I've never voted for anybody but a Republican. I shouldn't have said that. Now I'm announcing who I voted for. But I would have voted for Robert Kennedy Jr. in a heartbeat against Nikki Haley because she's a warmonger. And I'm not going to vote for warmongers.
Right.
But I at least want something. Give me something that I'm actually going to gain if I vote for you versus something that I'm going to gain if I either don't vote or vote for the other person.
Right.
Okay, but that said, so that's my bias exposed. But let's speak against our bias because GU, or going by Savas now, says, but look, didn't this exact same thing that you're talking about in terms of the political situation? He's saying it did happen under Trump. Pompeo was on Twitter bragging about facilitating this schism. So
it 100% did happen under Trump. And so the thing is Pompeo was a neocon, and he was I think he was at one time the head of the CIA, or he was from the CIA, and I think he was the Secretary of State at the time. But the U.S. State Department was 100% publicly backing the schismatics, and that did happen under Trump. The thing is, because of what J.D. Vance has had to say about this, I think there's good reason to believe that will not be the policy going forward. And I don't think you're going to see Mike Pompeo in a future Trump administration. But if Trump continues those policies, then I would be the first to criticize him for doing so.
Right.
The unfortunate thing is, one thing that Trump did was he exposed how corrupt our government was. I had no idea how corrupt our government was prior to Trump. But because you had basically the government coming after Trump before the 2016 election and after the 2016 election, and you also had the parts of the government revolting against Trump, our military was instructed by the commander-in-chief, Donald John Trump, to withdraw from Syria. And they lied to the commander-in-chief and did not withdraw our troops from Syria. That should concern anybody on any side of the political spectrum, because that was 100% constitutional. It was actually treason. And the Secretary of Defense could and should be brought up on charges of treason for doing that. But but the thing is, unfortunately, we live in a post-constitutional period of American history. We might eventually get some of it back, I hope. But our government has not been following the Constitution for a long time now, unfortunately. And so I'm not sure that Trump knew anything about what was going on in Ukraine in terms of its promotion of the schism. But I certainly hope that they have something to say about it if they do get elected.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's ridiculous. I mean, he commanded to, people under him, like they directly lied to Trump, right? He gave them commands to take,
and they blew it off.
Yeah, that's treason. Like that's
It is literal treason. Trump's been accused of treason, but for reasons that don't amount to treason. That is actual treason. When you take an oath to follow the orders or to the commanders-in-chief, and you lie to him, and you do what you're going to do anyway. And the unfortunate thing, this is not something that just happened under Trump. It just became more obvious under Trump.
Right.
But if you look at the last several presidents we've had, Obama went into office saying, I want to improve relations with Russia. And what happened when he got into office? Did Russia relations improve? No. George W. Bush said that he wanted to improve relations with Russia. Did relations with Russia improve under George W. Bush? No, they did not. Donald Trump said the very same thing. They concocted this whole Russian hoax that the Russians stole the election. And then Trump, because he was trying to prove that he was not a stooge of Putin because he was being constantly accused of it, wound up becoming very anti-Russian when he was in office. And that has pushed us literally to the brink of World War III. And if World War III happens, and if there are actually people still around to write the history of how World War III happened, they will point out that Russian hoax brought us to World War III. I hope that we are able to pull back from the brink, but we are so close to World War III right now. We are closer than we've been probably since the Cuban Missile Crisis, and probably even including the missile crisis.
What's the clock, the doomsday clock say now? Is it like 90 seconds to midnight or
Well,
closer
the thing
now?
is, the people who are in charge of that are political hacks, and so they probably haven't nudged it any closer. But the reality is, we're probably about 5 seconds to
5
midnight
seconds. Right.
if they were really being honest.
Right.
We're in a very bad situation. And the thing is, I have no love for the Chinese Communist Party. My wife is from China. She was born under the communists. Her family suffered under the communists. My mother-in-law's father was killed by the communists. My father-in-law was actually impressed into slave labor gangs that were sent into the rural parts of China, which is how he met my mother-in-law. One good thing that came out of that, but he was living a life that was far worse than any slave in America ever experienced, where he saw people being summarily executed. He had horrible trauma as a result of what he saw, and he was basically left for dead on the streets of Guizhou, and or Guiyang is the city, and that's how he wound up meeting my mother-in-law. But because he was coughing up blood, he had a heart problem, and he was no longer able to work, so they basically didn't need him anymore. But the thing is, as much as I would like to see Taiwan become an independent country, the time for the U.S. to have made Taiwan an independent country would have been maybe 1972, and because we could have made it happen back then. But we, because of various American policies, unfortunately, have built the Chinese economy to such a state that their military is now a peer nation. And we would be insane to get into a war over Taiwan. And the thing is, if we do get into a war over Taiwan, the only people who are going to suffer the people who are going to suffer the most are the people of Taiwan. Taiwan will be flattened. Probably millions of people will be dead at the end of the whole thing, and the Chinese Communist Party is going to win.
Right.
And there's no way our military can do anything about it, because China has hypersonic missiles. They can sink any ship we send into the area. It would be a disaster for us to get involved in that. And that's just the reality. And so for us to push this is only going to result in people dying and suffering. Why would we want to do that? We should have a policy where we are realistic, and we're also fair, and we're not trying to impose our will on other countries arbitrarily, and we're trying to actually get along with people. Because even life under the Soviet Union was far better than being in a war zone. Most people would have preferred to have lived in the 1980s in the Soviet Union than to living in Ukraine today. Because the life, you compare the life then with the life now in Ukraine, and it's not gotten better.
Right.
So we're not helping the situation.
Right. No, so I'm glad you brought it back to Ukraine, and I apologize for getting everybody off on the political stuff, but it's just, there's these things that I get excited about, and that's one of them, especially at this time, since we're so close to an election, and with all the propaganda that the mass media is promoting about Harris, about Biden, and all this nonsense it just inflames me, to be perfectly honest with you guys, because I think people are waking up though, and so I hope that shows on election day. But Father, let me ask you this, getting back to the subject of Ukraine and the Ukrainian church. Practically, now you've mentioned a lot of things that, practically speaking, and I don't know any other, so I'm not trying to offend any of our listeners. I don't think this will offend any of you guys, but any of our listeners that are under the Patriarch of Constantinople or anything like that. But it almost sounds like, and especially with recent statements that has been documented that you brought up earlier, Father, about, I forget exactly how it was worded, but
without equals.
You read my mind. You know where I'm going with this. Okay, fair enough. It almost seems like when So in 1054, or roughly thereafter, right, a couple centuries give or take, Orthodoxy broke off from Rome, or Rome left Orthodoxy, however you look at that. Then Constantinople seems to be following in their footsteps and is almost acting like the bigger dog in this fight. And what I mean by that is like and I think we would all agree that there are things that Patriarch Bartholomew and others before him, I think, correct me if I'm wrong on that, but it's like they're almost trying to act like what they got away from all those years ago, if not to more of a degree. Like, this is why we have jurisdictions to begin with, is so that we can handle our own things. I mean, you guys brought it up on the episode with Father Jonathan Ivanov and Jay Dyer about how Moses, like, all of this really can be traced back to the Old Testament, and how Moses delegated these different or these different people. Okay, you guys handle this, you guys handle that, you guys handle that. And obviously Moses is a type of Christ, not a type of the Pope, right, in that instance, right? And so to me, practically speaking, if Constantinople, specifically Patriarch Bartholomew or anybody that comes after him, continue on this route, I mean, practically, I think this goes without saying, but let me just ask, practically speaking, do we see things getting it doesn't seem like things are going to get better, but can we kind of predict how things would get worse if repentance doesn't happen, and if this line of reasoning continues and even continues to evolve? Like, it just doesn't seem to me like there's anything good that can come out of somebody trying to dictate how the rest of Orthodoxy runs things. I mean, for lack of better words.
Well, we can certainly predict it. And the thing is, ever since Meletios Metaxakis was elected as patriarch, you've had this ecumenistic direction in the ecumenical patriarchate. And by ecumenism, I mean ecumenism is a heresy that says that the Christian church is divided into branches, right, and so all the branches are really part of the same church, and we just need to kiss and make up and sweep everything under the rug and accept the lowest common denominator. And basically it comes out of Anglicanism, which is not coincidental, because the British were the ones that were the patrons of Meletios Metaxakis.
Right.
Their view is Anglicanism is one branch of the church, Roman Catholicism is another branch of the church, Orthodoxy is another branch of the church, and you have all these other smaller Protestant branches of the church, but we're all part of the same church. So that's never how the church has viewed itself. And back in the 1960s, you had Patriarch Athenagoras, who was flown to Constantinople on Harry Truman's a jet, which at that time was known as the Holy Cow by Harry Truman. It was before Air Force One got its name. But he flew Patriarch Athenagoras to Constantinople because he was elected with American help to be the next Patriarch of Constantinople. And that was when America, North and South America, came under the Ecumenical Patriarch, because prior to that they were under Greece. Mm-hmm. But when Athenagoras, who was over that church, was elected patriarch, he just decided to take North and South America with him. Mm-hmm. And he lifted the anathemas against the Pope in like 1969. But at the time they said, well, but that's just the anathemas against the Pope at the time of the schism in 1054. And, but basically they've been inching towards union with Rome, mm-hmm, step by step. Mm-hmm. The current Patriarch Bartholomew, is actually a graduate of the Orientalium in Rome, yep, which is a Jesuit institution which was designed to train missionaries to proselytize among the Orthodox.
Yeah.
And he speaks Italian like a Roman, I'm told. And so I think that it's not just mere coincidence or happenstance that he happened to have been a graduate from a Jesuit institution designed to proselytize the Orthodox. And he's already invited the Pope to come to a council next year to celebrate the 1700th anniversary of the Council of Nicaea. And he's also already announced, because next year is the last year for many years that the Orthodox Paschalian and the Western Paschalian will be on the same day. And he's already said, we are going to keep it that way going forward. Well, how is he going to do that? Well, I think there's going to be a lot of changes that are going to come out of that council. I hope I'm wrong. I hope he backs off. I hope something changes.
Sure.
But his behavior in the last several years has not been the behavior of a bishop that is endearing himself to the rest of the Orthodox Church. Only Alexandria, when the screws were put to them by means we don't know not what, they recognized the schismatics in Ukraine. And the Patriarch of Alexandria, he was educated in Ukraine. He'd always assured Metropolitan Onufriy that he would be there with him no matter what. He called on the people of Ukraine to stand with Metropolitan Onufriy no matter what. But somehow they put the screws to him and he recognized the schismatics, just like the Patriarch of Alexandria did the Living Church back in the 1920s and the 30s. So it's an exact repeat.
Right.
Cyprus, some of the bishops of Cyprus have recognized the schismatics. Some of the bishops of Greece have recognized the schismatics, and that is it. The rest of the Orthodox Church has said they're schismatics. As a matter of fact, the recently elected Patriarch of Bulgaria, Patriarch Daniel, was the candidate who clearly was opposed to recognizing the schism, and he was elected as their patriarch. And they just held a conference there about the persecution of the church in Ukraine. Yeah. So the Orthodox Church as a whole is lining up behind Metropolitan Onufriy. And I would say there are a lot of brave priests that I know of in the ecumenical patriarchate who have openly spoken against what's going on at the risk of their jobs, which, Greek priests get paid pretty well. So they're actually risking a lot when they do that, but some of them have done it. Mm-hmm. And I don't think that if they do go into union with Rome, they're going to get all the Greeks to go along with it. But I think they're going to take a chunk of them with them. And now, they seem to want to take a chunk of Ukraine too.
Let me ask you this, Father, because this is something I've really been struggling with lately. And I don't mean that as in, I'm just trying to figure the ecumenist battle out, right? Because, and I might have even misspoke the other day on a interview that I did with Amber, who runs the channel When Deep Calls Deep. And I've been, like I said, after that, and after kind of listening to specifically Father Peter Heers on the subject, because he speaks a lot about ecumenism. And so I don't really, and this might be a more of a learning experience for me at this point, but so what you've just said about ecumenism, let me try to put this in context for people that might not understand it, and you correct me if I'm wrong. Fair enough? Yeah. Okay, so whenever we're talking about being in communion with Rome, not us, but the people that you mentioned, depending on how this council goes, if we're talking about, and forgive me for kind of stumbling through this, because like I said, I've struggled with this, and this is kind of a new thing to me, really. But are we saying that we're going to be in communion with them and not try to work our disagreements out? Like we take their like where we disagree is obviously on things like papal infallibility, for example. We're saying we'll be in communion with you, but you guys can still hold to papal infallibility and we won't? Like, or we're going to accept papal infallibility? I just don't see how people can come back into communion with each other without working out their problems. You see what I'm saying?
Well, I think Patriarch Bartholomew is a papist at heart, if not in fact. Malachi Martin, who was a Jesuit priest and a Vatican insider, he wrote a book back in the 80s called The Keys of This Blood, which I happen to get a copy of because I joined one of those book clubs where for like 5 cents you could get 10 free books and all that.
Yeah, there you go.
Well, anyway, in that book, he said that at that time there was something like maybe 50 Orthodox bishops that were already in secret union with Rome. Maybe he was exaggerating. Maybe it's only 25. Maybe it's only 10. But I guarantee you, if there's anybody, Patriarch Bartholomew is one of them.
Okay.
And he is going to go into communion with Rome. But very recently, like this last year, they're laying the groundwork for what's going to happen next year, because Rome has already signed on to a statement in which they conceded a bunch of stuff to the Orthodox. They basically said, yeah, in most church history, the Pope did not have immediate jurisdiction over everybody, and so ostensibly you would think that Rome was walking back papal claims.
Yeah.
At the same time, the EP is making papal claims. And so the thing is, I think that's all window dressing. And I think the way they're going to try to sell it to the average Greek is to say, hey, look, we won. They've agreed with us, so we can go and commune with them. Isn't that great? But they're going to go into communion with them, but the Pope is going to continue to function the way they've been functioning. You don't see the Pope actually functioning like just a mere Orthodox patriarch would function. He's still exercising immediate jurisdiction throughout the entire Roman Catholic world.
Right. So this would be, and I don't mean to interrupt. Hold on just a second, Dale. I'm on a roll. So I promise I'll give it to you. So this would be like saying, all right, Arius, we're lifting the anathema on Arius, and everyone that holds to Arianism, we're going to commune with you now.
Right.
I absolutely vehemently disagree with that. Like that, no. So I said the other day, okay, if that's what we mean by ecumenism, I am not an ecumenist at all. Like at all. So I said, go ahead.
Well, one thing that, I didn't really know the history of all this, but, and I used to not watch Jay Dyer very much until I started having a steady flow of inquirers. When I would ask them how you found out about Orthodoxy, they would say by watching Jay Dyer. So I started watching Jay Dyer some, and he's done several shows where he's talked about institutional capture. And particularly he's talked about how after World War II, the U.S. intelligence agencies captured the Vatican. And he was appealing to books that are written by reputable people and published by reputable publishers. Operation Gladio was what it was called.
Okay.
And basically they used blackmail and other means to put their people in the Vatican and eventually to gain control over the Vatican so the United States could dictate to the Vatican what they wanted them to do. At the same time, they did the same thing with a lot less effort over Constantinople. The thing about the Orthodox Church is because it's decentralized, you can't capture all the local churches. It just doesn't work.
Right.
But our government's been doing the same thing with other churches. Just recently, there's a book about what's been going on with the Baptists and the evangelicals. Shepherds for Sale by Megan Basham.
Yep, I've heard
The only thing is she's not connecting the dots with all these foundations in our government. That's the only step that she's not going. But those same foundations have deep ties to our intelligence apparatus. And a lot of them are just CIA cutouts. Yeah. And so our government has a policy of trying to influence the world through capturing religions. Yeah. And they're trying to do the same thing to the Orthodox Church. That's the reason why they backed the schism in Ukraine. They want the Orthodox Church to have a big schism because they want to reduce the influence of the Russian Church, not because they care about any theological or ecclesiological issue. They just want the power. That all they care about is the power.
Go ahead, Dale. Thank you for that, Father. I appreciate it. Wow.
Yeah, very, very interesting that you guys.
And no, I didn't lie to anybody, Dale.
You are a heretic, Tyler.
Get out of here.
You are the new heretic, David Russell. He's been replaced. So
yeah.
So I'm kind of curious. So about ecumenism and stuff like that. So I've seen bits and pieces from leaders in that movement between Protestants and Catholics specifically and stuff like that. But I'm kind of curious about, you've been kind of talking about, look, between the institutions or between Protestants versus Catholics, ironing out doctrines and stuff like that. And I don't think those can work. Like I think that you guys have, Catholics and Orthodox have what I believe to be clearly anathemas, for lack of a better word, and vice versa. I think the Orthodox Church teaches that Protestants have that in terms of the systems. But I'm kind of wondering on an individual level, do you think that some sort of ecumenism could work on a individual level. So say if I as an individual have all the essential beliefs or something like that, could I be saved regardless of what institution I'm in? So yeah, so Tyler's a great example.
That's a good question, Dale. Go ahead.
Yeah.
No, keep going.
So basically, well, you got more to the question, or is that the question?
I can just give an example, like between me and Tyler, if you need it. Do you need an example, or do you get it?
No, I know what you're talking about because I was a Protestant too. And actually, when I was making the transition from Protestantism to Orthodoxy, there was a brief period of time where I started to think about things in more of an ecumenical way. Mm-hmm. But then when I began to understand what Orthodoxy was all about, I realized that was erroneous. But the thing is, the Orthodox Church doesn't judge anybody outside of the church. When we make you find a lot of Protestant apologists that will say, well, the Orthodox anathematize everybody who doesn't venerate icons. That means they were anathematizing, every pious Southern Baptist granny that doesn't venerate icons. Well, the thing about the Orthodox Church is we have canonical principles you can read about if you read our famous canonists. And an anathema is only a warning unless it's applied to someone specifically. So if the Orthodox Church says anyone who refuses to venerate icons is an anathema, that's a warning. But if the Orthodox Church says so-and-so is anathema because they reject icons, that's a judgment that the church is making. That person is anathema. And they did that at the time of the Seventh Ecumenical Council because they were anathematizing people who had been persecuting the Orthodox on this very issue. And they were saying, you people are in error, and we are declaring you to be cut off from the church. And if you don't repent, you're going to go to hell. That's basically what they were saying. But that doesn't mean that, more than 1,000 years later, pious Protestants that don't know anything about the Seventh Ecumenical Council and have never heard anything about Orthodoxy are under this anathema because they reject something that they don't know anything about. We believe that God judges people based on the light that they've been given, and I've known very many very pious Protestants in my life that didn't know anything about Orthodoxy. And I don't think on the day of judgment that God's going to say, well, I know that you spent your whole life trying to serve me, but you didn't become Orthodox. I know you didn't know anything about it, but too bad, you're going to hell. I don't believe that's going to happen. And the Orthodox Church doesn't teach that. What we do teach is the normal means of salvation, which is through the church. We don't teach the abnormal means of salvation. Like the thief on the cross was saved, even though he wasn't baptized, he never took communion, he didn't do any of those things, but he was saved because he confessed Christ, and Christ sovereignly declared him to be saved and that he would be with him in paradise. And there's lots of people in the history of the world that never heard anything about the gospel, never heard anything about Christianity. But yet the Gospel of John in its first chapter says that Christ is the true light that gives light to every man that comes into the world. Mm-hmm. So everybody's been given some measure of the light, and to whom much is given, much is required, but to whom little is given, less is required by logical extrapolation. So, some guy living in a jungle in the Amazon who never heard the gospel is held to a very different standard than someone who grew up in the Orthodox Church and was properly taught the Orthodox faith. So how God will save people who are not part of the Orthodox Church is between them and God. St. Paul says God will judge those outside of the church. Yeah. And so we leave that to God. Now, when I was a Nazarene still, I remember we had a lecturer who talked about the idea of prevenient grace, which is the idea that God's grace goes before the gospel and opens people's hearts to the gospel. And the lecturer was suggesting that prevenient grace could save people without them ever even hearing the gospel. Mm. And we broke into small groups. and I happened to be in a group that included a Nazarene missionary who had been a missionary to Korea. And there was some college student in that class that said, well, given what was said, why do we even bother sending missionaries overseas? Because we're just making them more responsible. We're adding to their condemnation if they don't embrace the gospel. Whereas if we just left them alone, they would be held to a lesser standard.
Right. Don't
and
evangelize.
What this missionary said, which I thought was a very insightful response, he said, you can say that someone could be saved without ever hearing the gospel, and I can accept that, just like I can accept the idea that someone could get into a kayak and they could sail across the Pacific Ocean and make it to the other side. I think it's possible. But if there's an ocean liner that can take that person across the ocean, it'd be far better for that person to get into the ocean liner than it would be for them to take their chances with the kayak. Mm-hmm. I thought that was a very insightful observation, and that's how we would view it. Our message to everybody is you should become Orthodox, but we're not. We have no insights into how God is going to judge someone who's sincere, but outside of the church. We can only say that we believe that God is merciful and He's loving, and He doesn't hold people accountable for things that they don't know.
And see, just to add to that, Father, and please correct me if I'm wrong on this, because again, this is one thing I've really been struggling with this, is that I see some Orthodox Christians, and again, not going to mention any names or anything like that, but they do go that extra step and say, if you're not Orthodox, that means you're hellbound. And I'm just like...
And usually they're converts. and
recent.
And the thing is, they're latching on to certain literal statements, but the thing is, what you have to understand is there's almost always exceptions. If you study Orthodox liturgics, you'll often see statements that say, well, we always do this except.
Right. Well, and go ahead. Sorry.
Well, there's an assistant priest I have who basically suggested that we could take the Beatles song "Let It Be" and change the words to "Except It Be." There are no exceptions, except it be.
Right. Right. Okay. I feel a little bit better about this because this is what Father Joseph Gleason and I talked about on our show about infant damnation, right? What does the Orthodox Church say generally? And I loved Father Joseph's answer to that because it wasn't it wasn't black and white. What I got from that conversation the most is that you're right. There is a general way in which we speak. Generally, yes, you have to be baptized. Generally, yes, you have to participate in the Lord's Supper. But then people will come back and say, well, what about this? What about if somebody's, and I always hear this one. What about if somebody's on their way to their baptism and they get hit by a car? And this is where I'm just like, whoa. I'm glad I'm not God. God's the one making those decisions.
Exactly.
I'm not saying He can't save out of the ordinances and out of the sacraments. I mean, obviously, yes, generally speaking, we receive grace through the sacraments. But then, okay, if we're going to say that's the only way, then we literally have to condemn every infant that has not been born, that has not been baptized, to hell. And I don't think anybody's willing to do that. Some, don't get me wrong, there are some people that say that, but I'm not one of them. And so if I'm going to take that stance, then logically I have to say, okay, it seems as though God does save outside the realm of the general, right? And
aside from that, the thing is there's a lot of ambiguities about what will happen at the Great Judgment.
Right.
And how God will sort things out that the Orthodox Church does not have definitive statements on.
Right.
There's an icon that I saw when I was at the Old Wright Parish in Erie, Pennsylvania, which if you ever are in Erie, Pennsylvania or near there, you want to go to see because one of the best iconographers in the world frescoed that entire church. And unlike most churches, the frescoes all have English inscriptions, so you can actually read them without knowing a foreign language. Well, there's on the western wall of churches, there's usually an icon of the Last Judgment. Mm-hmm. And off to the side, there was a very interesting icon that I saw where you had a guy who he had his arms tied behind a pillar. So he was strapped to a pillar. Yeah. and an angel was holding a scroll. And on the scroll said, because of your fornication, you are denied entrance into the kingdom of heaven.
Mm-hmm.
But because of your charity, you were spared the torments of hell. And when I was in Romania about 2 years ago, almost to the week,
yeah,
I saw an icon exactly like that in a very old church in Romania. So there's this idea that there may be very different degrees of punishments for people. And Christ talks about in the gospel, the servant that knew not his master's will be beaten with few stripes.
Right.
But the servant that knew his master's will and didn't do it is going to be beaten with many stripes. So there's going to be different degrees of punishment.
Right.
And one of those degrees of punishment apparently is going to be that you're going to be denied entrance to the kingdom of heaven, but spared the torments of hell. We don't know. And the thing is, we put that in God's hands, but we do know what God has revealed as the normal means of salvation, and that's what we proclaim to the world.
Right.
You can be saved this way. We know that.
Right.
Okay, so just to clarify then, getting rid of the exceptions, because I had a discussion with an atheist philosopher named Dr. Richard Schunig, and he had a bunch of categories. So you guys have kind of ticked off those and stuff like that, but he had one last category, and I want to get your take on this from an Orthodox perspective. So this is the category you hear the proper essential gospel message from your guys' perspective, like whatever the Orthodox say is necessary there, and it's the proper message, so you don't mishear it or you don't get a faulty gospel message. But yet he said his category was you still honestly just you don't believe, you don't accept it, kind of thing, at least for the time being, kind of thing. Would you guys say, well, those person, yes, you've heard the proper gospel, you haven't misunderstood it, you haven't gotten a flawed version of it, and because you haven't accepted it, then you're damned? Or is there, how does that work?
The thing is, what we would say is they'll be judged according to their works, and they might be denied entrance to the kingdom of heaven, but spared the torments of hell. We don't know. But the thing is, what we do know is that on the day of judgment, when we are hearing God's judgment, nobody's going to be able to justly say, man, God was way over the top with that one. I don't know how he could possibly justify what he did there. Right. We're going to know that all those judgments are righteous and just. And so I don't think, you have people who defend universalism on the basis that, hey, even if you're Adolf Hitler, you've committed millions of murders and you lived a wicked life and you died, does that justify being roasted on a spit in hell for all eternity? Well, the thing is, those things are images we find in scripture that basically tell you don't want to wind up here. But exactly how that will play out,
right,
we don't know, but it won't be unjust.
Right.
And the thing is, because I believe the scriptures are the inspired word of God and are infallible and inerrant, I'm not going to say everybody will ultimately be saved when the scriptures clearly don't teach that. But that doesn't necessarily mean that hell is going to be like it would be if you were literally torturing someone by taking a flamethrower and burning their feet for all eternity. I don't know.
Right.
But that, but God knows, and we know that God is loving and he's just, and whatever people experience will be just.
Right.
For example, when Christ talks about the worm that dieth not and the flame that is never quenched, there are fathers that say that that's the conscience of the person that is gnawing at them and is never quenched. So who knows? I'm not going to say that hell is not terrible, because the Bible paints a pretty dark picture of it. I would say don't go there.
Right.
I don't want to find out by experience what hell is like personally.
Yeah.
And I'm not going to tell anybody else that they should try their luck with it.
Yeah.
But I don't know. I just know that God is just and he's merciful and he's loving, and I'm not going to try to second guess what the scriptures say.
This might be the first time this has ever happened, Father, but you're going to have an Orthodox Christian paraphrase Charles Spurgeon. Fair enough. Can we do
Sure.
that? I don't know if we can do that or not legally.
I like Charles Spurgeon.
All right. So it would be a lot easier if the elect had a yellow stripe going down their back, and we could say, "Yep, you're getting in. Nope, you're not. You got the yellow stripe. You're damned. You got the yellow stripe. Or I'm sorry, you don't have the yellow stripe. Yep, you're damned. You're going to hell. Sorry for you. You got the yellow stripe. Okay, good. You're in." I'm more becoming Orthodox, and now I know there's going to be different people, depending on where they're coming from, going to say, "Yep, me too," and that's the problem with Orthodoxy. But since I became Orthodox, I've gotten a lot more comfortable saying I don't know about salvation than saying you're saved and you're not. Right?
Right. That the thing is, we're not
the judge.
We're not competent to make those kinds of declarations. Now we can and should judge that certain things are wrong. So if somebody's living in a homosexual relationship, I can 100% say that that's a sinful relationship, and that St. Paul says that people who engage in that kind of behavior will not inherit the kingdom of God.
Right.
But exactly how that individual will be judged on the day of judgment, I cannot say.
Right.
Because I don't know what their relationship with God is. I don't know if they're struggling with the sin that they have. They might repent at the last minute.
Yep.
They might be saved, and I might go to hell because they repent at the last minute. I don't know. Mm-hmm. I have to leave that in God's hand because I'm not God, but God has revealed to us that certain things are sin. So we have to judge sins. And we can say that when somebody does a certain thing, that's a sinful thing.
Right.
We just don't know their heart. We don't know whether they repented. We don't know what they will do down the road either. So we can't say that person's going to hell and this person's not.
The drunk monk is the story that gets me. Like, I literally cried the first time I heard that because I have similar sins that I struggle with. And I think we're human. We don't judge the heart. God does, right? And so for those who don't know, just the brief summary, there was a monk that entered a monastery. I forget names. Father, you might help me out with that. But he came in the monastery drinking 20 bottles a day, right? And over time, he progressed down to, 4 or 3 bottles, and he died. And the other monks around was like, "Oh no, he's gone to hell. He died as a drunkard." Clearly, 1 Corinthians 6 says that no drunkards will enter the kingdom of heaven. And then the abbot of the monastery comes and says, "No, I saw the angels come and take him away." Right? Well, why? Because he struggled. That's the point. I don't know if I'll reach perfection here or not.
Well, there's another saying from the Desert Fathers that's very similar to that, but there was a certain monk who lived a very careless life, and he was ashamed of the monastery, and when he died, the monks kind of felt some relief that now the monastery could regain its reputation. Mm-hmm. And then the abbot had a vision that this guy was in heaven, and he asked the monk, "How did you get there?" and he said, "You were lazy. You nipped at the altar wine when you had a chance. You did this, you did that."
Yeah.
And the monk said, "All the things that you say are true, but the one thing I never did was I never judged anyone." And Christ promised that judge not lest ye be judged. And because I didn't judge anyone, I was given a light judgment.
Yeah. Condemn not lest you be condemned. And it's so simple in that aspect. You're right. And I think that's the thing that I've gotten a lot from just different Orthodox pastors and priests and shepherds of the church, right? Mm-hmm. Is that Orthodoxy is a lifestyle. It's not something you read about. It's not merely a mental game, right? This is a life. And a good Christian is one that struggles with sin. I mean, we're all sinners. And that's the point, is becoming more like Christ. Not necessarily reaching that as your time is here on earth. Yes, God has given that grace to certain people, and God bless them, right?
Right.
But those of us who are struggling with sin, which I'm sure is everybody here and everybody watching, maybe not, I don't know. I know me, right? And Amber said it the best, I think, here. She says, "I'm not comfortable saying you're not saved. I'm not omniscient. I don't know their heart." And that's the point I was going to make. God judges the heart. we don't know someone's intentions like God does, right? I kind of know what I'm intending, but my intentions change day to day. And so that's why I'm saying I'm not comfortable as I once was saying, I'm saved, you're not, or you're saved, I'm not, whatever, right? We repent, we struggle, we continue to strive. As St. Paul said, continue to run the race, right? That's the best we can do. And
Right.
so anyway.
Right. So our obligation is to proclaim the gospel and to teach accurately what the faith that we've received. And so I can't say to someone who's living in a homosexual relationship, hey, you got nothing to worry about. God's loving. It's all good.
Right.
But that doesn't mean that on the day of judgment, that person's going to hell. I don't know. And the thing is, when St. Paul says, I am the chief of sinners, this is a faithful saying worthy of all acceptance. We're taught to think of ourselves literally as being the worst of sinners. And when we see people who maybe in an objective sense are sinning worse than us, we're supposed to be thinking, well, they probably don't know as much as I know. Had they been given as much of the truth as I've been given, they would probably be far ahead of me.
Right.
And so that's the way we're supposed to look at ourselves. We're supposed to judge ourselves and not judge other people in that sense. And then just to trust in God's mercy, that God is loving and merciful, because we're never going to earn our salvation, as we've talked about on other shows. But we should trust in God's mercy and actually strive to live a holy life. And what's the standard that I'm held to is going to be very different than a standard that someone who's never heard the gospel is held to.
That's right.
And they might be saved, and I may not be if I don't live according to the truth that I've been given. So I have to strive to live according to the truth that I've been given.
No, you're absolutely right. I just want to quote, I think this is, here it is. This is a prayer that we all pray before the Eucharist. So, and this is just for people that don't know this, but what we're talking about, what Father John just said, is absolutely true, and this is expressed, I think, most clearly in our Divine Liturgy. So, I believe, O Lord, and I confess that Thou art truly the Christ, the Son of the living God, who camest in the world to save sinners, of who I am chief, or of whom I am first. And to say that is, and first of all, believe it, but really see it, and then to go on and say, right, I believe this is your immaculate body. I believe this is your precious blood.
Right.
Have mercy on me. That's the promise that people, I think, it's like it's the most talked about, but yet whenever practically applied, it's the least, or it's the most forgotten. God is merciful, and he does have, that's the promise. What probably the greatest promise of the covenants that God has given us is that to promise to be merciful to whom he chooses. And whom has he chosen? The humble, right? To humble yourself before God. And it's like, okay, fair enough. I mean, and I think people get so wrapped up in the cage stage, like that we were talking about earlier. Well, if you don't believe exactly like me, then you're going to go to hell, like automatic. Father, correct me if I'm wrong, but this is not what the Orthodox Church teaches.
No.
It's to submit yourself before God.
Right.
Okay.
And things like, I could tell you stories about Nazarenes that I knew that were very holy people who died before I knew anything about Orthodoxy, really.
Yeah.
And they certainly didn't know anything about Orthodoxy. But I can't believe that those people are going to roast in hell for all eternity.
Yeah.
But I would say that the Orthodox faith that I discovered, I wish that they were still around so I could introduce them to them, because I think that they would be a lot happier in the Orthodox Church. There's truth and stability. The Nazarene Church that I grew up in does not even exist anymore. It still exists on paper, but you cannot find Nazarene churches that still worship like I did. I was just out of curiosity. There was I think it's the biggest Nazarene church in the world, Bethany First Church of the Nazarene, right next to the college I graduated from.
Yeah.
And out of curiosity, I looked at their YouTube channel to see what their worship services were like. And they have a traditional service and a contemporary service. I thought, well, let me look at their traditional service. Their traditional service was a praise and worship service. I'm not sure what made that traditional, unless contemporary worship has gone many steps beyond what used to be contemporary worship.
Yeah.
But it's nothing like what I grew up with. And my mother, before she passed away, could not find a Nazarene church that was like the church that she grew up in, or the church that she raised me and my brothers in. And she wound up going to a United Methodist church that had an old folk service that was kind of like what she grew up in.
Mm-hmm.
But a church ought to not be unrecognizable between the time that you grow up and the time that you become an adult. And the Orthodox Church is still going to be recognizable by my grandkids when they're adults.
Yeah.
But I don't know about the Nazarene Church.
Right.
I don't know about the Southern Baptist Church.
Well, just coming out of the Southern Baptist Church, it's changed so much that you're right. It's definitely seems unrecognizable. And to that point, because I've kind of flushed out, one side of this coin, I'm exactly with you, Father. Like, would I love it if everyone on Faith Unaltered and everyone listening would become Orthodox? Duh. That's why I'm here. You know what I mean? So because there is a benefit to that in the realm of salvation, right? And so what we're not saying is do whatever, you're fine, right? Ecumenism in that sense of the word. But what we are saying is that, and I'm saying this, I don't want to speak for anybody else but me, is that whenever it comes to salvation proper, right, I am striving not to earn my salvation, but and I'll just use biblical terminology, to reach the finish line. Like, this is my race that I'm focused on. I'm worried about 3 other people in the world, and that's my wife and my 2 kids, right? I'm worried now, in a sense, about everybody. Don't get me wrong. But what I'm not going to say is that, yes, you're saved. No, you're not. That's not my call.
Right.
And so, yes, I proclaim the Orthodox faith to as many people that will listen to it. But at the same time, and will say, join me, like, come and see, like Jesus did, right? And Philip and Nathaniel, come and see, come and be a part of this. There's benefit there. But at the same time, I'm not willing to say, but if you don't, that means you're going to hell. So, okay. Father, I think I do want to give everybody a chance to kind of, like, because I did end that on a pretty big cliffhanger. But so Father, and I know Dale, you want to jump in. So let's do a last round, and because we're at the 2-hour mark, and I definitely want to respect everybody's time. But let me say this too first, real quick. Let me give a shameless plug before I get everybody's last thoughts, so you guys can kind of think of what you're going to say here. Ukraine, and everything else we've talked about. Salvation is really on my mind right now. Ecumenism. So I'll let you guys think about some final thoughts while I'm doing this. But if anybody is interested, and I promised Colton I would do this for the next 6 months, so GreekForSheep.com, and let me pull up the banner, is offering, so for those who don't know, what Greek for Sheep is Colton Moore, a good friend of mine, and I'm one of his students, a good teacher of mine, is offering beginner, intermediate, advanced exegesis, exegesis and advanced exegesis. So 4 different classes for students of the Greek language that wants to either learn Greek, that has been learning Greek, that is a Greek guru. There is literally something at Greek for Sheep for everyone. He offers 4 classes beginning, so you can still sign up. You've only got a couple days left to sign up for the next beginner class. The deadline is September 1st. If you cannot make that, and classes begin September 9th, if you can't make that, Colton is offering all the classes, beginner, intermediate, exegesis, and advanced exegesis. January the 1st is the deadline to sign up. Right now, Colton's offering a 30% discount if you enter discount code FAITH25. So GreekForSheep.com, enter discount code FAITH25. This is only for Faith Unaltered listeners. You will get not 25% off, which I don't know why he put FAITH25, but whatever, but you'll get
It's
30%
a secret
off.
Trump message.
It's a secret Trump message. That's right. That's right. 30% off Greek for Sheep, any one of the classes. And so super cheap. Go ahead, Dale.
Shouldn't it be Faith 47 then if it's a secret Trump message?
It should be Faith 47.
Project 2025 that the Democrats keep talking about. I think that might be the message.
That's it. That's it. You will get a free pamphlet of the Project 2025 when you sign up for GreekForSheep.com, Faith25, and get your 30% discount code. I'm taking the exegesis class, and it is phenomenal. Colton teaches you how to Bible arc, and in and of itself, so actually Colton's going to start offering free Bible arcing classes. So it's kind of, think of Daily Dose of Greek, but instead of giving the Greek text, Colton's going to give the English text and only focus on arcing, so you get an understanding of what Bible arcing is. And then if you want to dive deeper into it, Colton offers 16-week semester classes that will teach you in depth about the Greek language and about how to Bible arc in Greek. It's a fascinating thing. If you need some time to save up some money to do it, each class, I'll go ahead and be completely transparent. Each class involves free textbooks, which is something a lot of seminaries and private tutors don't do. You have to go buy your textbooks, which I get it, but Colton's offering free textbooks, one-on-one time with him personally once a week for an hour, and he will run you through everything you need to know. So GreekForSheep.com, enter discount code Faith25, and get 30% off everything Colton has to offer. It's $420 a class for 16 weeks, $420. Break that down, $100 a month. Can't beat it. Not for a not for a language class, a New Testament language class. All right, Father, I will turn it over to you for some final thoughts while we're winding down the episode. Go ahead.
Well, getting back to the whole Ukraine thing, just this Monday, Ted Cruz, who's up for re-election this year, had a breakfast with area clergy in the Houston area. And so I drove across town praying that I would have an opportunity to have a few words with him. Mm-hmm. And I got to shake his hand, and I briefly was able to ask him. I said, the Ukrainian government has outlawed the Orthodox Church in Ukraine, and he nodded his head and said, "Oh, yes, yes, yes." And I said, and I would like to ask you to tie any future funding for Ukraine to their respect for religious freedom. And he said, yes, yes, yes. So that was a very short conversation. I got to shake his hand, but the thing is, anybody can do this. Everybody has a congressional representative in this country that is up for re-election this year. And if you check their schedule, you could probably find an occasion where you'll get to shake their hand, and you could say the same thing to your representatives. And I would encourage you to do so. You can also pick up the phone and call them and tell them that you don't appreciate your tax dollars going to fund the persecution of your church. Mm. And I would also say you should say the same thing about what's going on in Gaza and the West Bank, because we have Orthodox Christians in both places that are being persecuted and in many cases being killed or imprisoned and raped by Israeli soldiers simply because they're Palestinians, and they're doing that to Muslims and they're doing that to Christians. And that's with our tax dollars and with our weapons, and you should express your disapproval of that. So talk to your representatives, talk to your senator, and if you don't know who represents you, you can Google it and find out. In Texas, at least, I know if you Google who represents me, there's a website where you can punch in your address, and it will tell you everybody who represents you all the way down to like the county government. And so you can contact your representatives, but it's your federal representatives and your presidential candidates that you want to harass on this subject, because they're the ones that have some say about what goes on in Ukraine and Israel. And I guarantee you that if Ted Cruz picked up the phone and called the Ukrainian ambassador and said, "Hey, I'm going to vote against any bill funding you if you don't stop persecuting the Ukrainian church," that they would probably start paying attention. If they got a couple of calls like that, they would probably decide, you know what, reverse course, whoop, 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 reverse, because they would realize, hey, this is going to really hurt us if we don't change what we're doing. So we need to put the We need to use our power as American citizens who have a right to vote and have some say in who represents us, and do what we can to influence our government to do the right thing.
Agree. I agree 100%. Dell, closing thoughts.
Yeah. So yeah, I guess it was an interesting conversation. So a lot of history, some of which I knew, most of which I didn't. So it was new for me, and that sort of thing. So that's great. I'm always into history, going beyond just the History Channel version. So I thank Father John for giving that lesson there. Obviously, on politics, I tend to agree. Even stronger, I'm happy to come out full endorsement for Trump. Although I should be careful, because instead of a Russia hoax, you'll now have a Canada hoax. I'm not an American, right? So, but yeah, I thought it was good, and it was interesting and stuff like that. Obviously, I come from a Protestant perspective, so I don't always agree with everything and stuff like that. But this is again about learning different perspectives, as it was with Shabir. We had Shabir on the other day. I definitely disagree with him as a Muslim, but
yeah,
it's good to hear the different perspectives. So yeah, thank you for having me on. And I am taking a vacation, but it looks like I'm not going to be getting a vacation, because I just realized that I just got an email from, he's an Orthodox guy, famous Christian Egyptologist, Dr. David Falk. And he's a famous shroud skeptic, and he wants to come on to my show to speak about, his take on the shroud. So that might be a special show happening in September.
Okay.
We'll see if I can delay it, though, till October, but we'll see.
You can always say no, Dale. You can always say no.
Leave the shroud alone.
Are you, Father John, what's your take on the shroud before we end? I'm kind of curious.
I think it's legitimate. I think that there's a good case to be made that the icon not made by hands is actually the Shroud of Turin, and that the Crusaders took it when they sacked Constantinople, and that's how it wound up where it currently is.
Interesting. Okay. And you said it's authentically miraculous image. It's not just historically authentic, but yeah.
Well, the thing is, it's undoubtedly 2,000 years old, roughly, and it has spores that shows that it has been in the areas that tradition would say that it would have been in. It's been in Palestine, it's been in Edessa, and it's been in Constantinople, because there are spores from plants that scientists have examined that show that's been in those areas and matches the flora and the fauna in those areas.
Awesome. Well, yeah, you check out my show sometime on Real Seekers. I have an entire playlist called Shroud Words where I get into the details of the shroud. So if that's your cup of tea, then check that out.
Right. So those of you who don't like icons, take that.
Okay, I'll take it.
Savas asked one question, Father, and he also apparently is starting a petition to add Father John Whiteford to the Faith Unaltered stable of hosts. So you're on here enough to become at least a monthly supporter of, or a monthly host at least, but I know you're super busy. And so, but the question Savas asked, who's a good friend and a good moderator of mine. So this is a loaded question, obviously, but Father, this all seems convoluted. Why should I leave my Bible-believing Protestant church? We don't have any of this. And so the geopolitical rifts, the schisms within Orthodoxy, that's what he's referring to. He sent this like super early into the discussion whenever we were talking about Ukraine. So if a Protestant is watching this, hearing all the mess that the Orthodox Church is into, well, why should they leave their Protestant church where they're safe and sound and come into this nonsense? Like, why would people do that?
And sorry, before you answer, can I also just tack on to that?
Yeah, go ahead.
Because I am curious, because even you yourself, I've seen on shows, you do kind of stick it to Protestants about all the division and stuff like that and sex. So what's the difference here? So, answer Tyler, and then answer and how is that any different than the Protestants?
That's a good point. Go ahead, Father.
Well, what I would say is that the schism in Ukraine is almost certainly going to be healed eventually. I mean, there might be some minority of schismatics that continue to be separate from the Orthodox Church, but the schisms in the Orthodox Church tend to be few and far between, and they don't generally last. There's been like maybe every 300 years in church history, there's a schism that actually does have some longevity after that. But in the case of the Protestants, that happens about every week. And then the other thing is Protestant denominations consistently drift to the left. And that's the reason why Protestants keep trying to establish new denominations, because pious Protestants don't want to be in churches where they teach that homosexuality is okay and the Bible is a lie. But yet their denominations keep going in that direction. So they should start asking themselves the question, why is that? Why is it that the Nazarene Church that I grew up in, which was a very conservative Protestant evangelical denomination when I was growing up, is nothing like what I grew up in? And they actually did recently defrock a Nazarene pastor who wrote a book on why the Nazarene Church should be LGBTQ affirming. So at least for the time being, they've not gone totally down that road. But I wouldn't want to bet a lot of money that won't happen in the next 50 years. And I wouldn't bet a lot of money that won't happen in the Southern Baptist Church either, even though the Southern Baptist Church was like the one exception in terms of mainline denominations that were resisting that leftward shift. And I do think the United States government has something to do with that, but it's also true that Protestantism tends to drift in a rationalistic direction. And even fundamentalists, when they argue with modernists, argue in a rationalistic way. And when I became Orthodox, I realized that I didn't have to play on that field. I didn't have to play the rationalistic game anymore.
So that's a fair answer. Just the one quick follow up, and we are trying to end, but that's another thing I always want to ask, because I don't understand it. Like this rationalistic thing. I mean, we just spent 2 hours. You sounded very rationalistic to me. You were arguing like a Westerner, right? You're giving the history and order, and you had sequential thoughts that one thought flowed from another. You were deriving conclusions. So that's logical. That's rational.
Well, being rationalistic and being rational are not the same thing. And we do believe in logic, and we believe in facts and history. But the thing is, if I was arguing with an evolutionist, for example, I would not try to out-argue them on the paleontology and the geology question. I would talk about it in a theological way. And if I had someone who was a parishioner who was saying, I don't know what to believe, I'm hearing all this stuff that sounds like evolution is true, but yet I know that the Bible teaches that God created the world, so what should I think? I would explain to them how to think about Scripture in a way that would not cause them to feel like, well, I've got to become a paleontologist so I can argue with evolutionists, and I've got to become a geologist too, and on top of all that, fundamentalists almost have to become experts on those subjects to even proclaim the gospel to people, because you get on the street, you start talking about the gospel, someone says, well, what about evolution? And then they feel like they have to go toe to toe with that person. But if you're Orthodox, you say, you know what? That doesn't matter. Well, let's talk about God. Let's talk about the fact that God exists, and there's no way the universe could exist without God. And I wouldn't even play the game of arguing about evolution with someone who I met on the street that was trying to use that as an excuse for not believing in God.
Gotcha. Okay. Yeah, that makes sense.
All right, guys. All right. Well, with that being said, I want to thank Father John. As always, it's a pleasure to have you with us. I would love, and if you're interested, so I was thinking whenever we did the Total Depravity episode with Warren about touching on, and obviously this can be later, or unless you want to do another 4-hour episode now. No, I'm just playing. On unconditional election, limited atonement, irresistible grace, perseverance of the saints. I would love to flesh that out with you in separate episodes coming up if you're interested in doing that. Okay, awesome. Because Father Joseph Gleason and I are going to be, it's in the works. We haven't got anything set in stone yet, but there's going to be a series, and I'll leave this as a surprise for people for right now, but we're working on a separate series as well that really doesn't have anything to do with Tulip, but the point I'm trying to make is I would love to get different Orthodox priests on to discuss like a series of things that's relevant to what we've talked about before. And so if you're interested in doing that, I'd love to do that. So thank you for coming on and potentially being a part of that in the future. Dale, as always, it's an awesome pleasure to have you. I couldn't have done this episode tonight. This would have panned out completely differently if you weren't here. And so thank you, Dale, for being my backup. I really, really appreciate. Although I think I was more your backup this time. We're going to turn you into the charismatic the charismatic Canadian. We're going to do it, Dale, and people's going to like you eventually. We're going to do it.
And charismatic, not in the theological sense.
No, a charisma about you. Yeah, no. We're not going to have Dale speaking in tongues anytime soon, I don't think, anyway. No. But, and as always, thank you to our wonderful audience. Thank you so much to our members who are financially supporting us. If you would be interested in doing that, we're going to start, I think, we're going to do a members-only live stream in October. That's the plan. I think we're going to hit our 25 members only goal, or 25 members goal. We're at right now, I think we're at 20 if I'm not mistaken. So 5 more people to sign up super cheap, $2.99 a month for the low tier and $4.99 a month for the high tier or the mid tier. I'm thinking about adding another tier later on, but I've got to come up with some more stuff to be able to do that. But right now, if you do take that high tier, then if you recommend us, it's not more of a recommendation because we will do it, but recommend a topic or anything that you would like to see, we will make that happen. So that's the benefits of doing the extra $3 a month. But you get members only live streams, early access to videos, and all just fun little things. Hangout session with us. If you want to not talk theology, we don't have to. Get to know us in our personal lives. If you want to talk theology is my personal life, so come and hang out and talk to me about some more theology, whatever you want to talk about. But that's for our members only, and a huge shout out to our subscribers. If you're here for the first time, please consider subscribing. That is completely free. Just hit the big red subscribe button on our homepage. And again, if you would like to donate to us financially, you can do that one of 4 ways now. Join the memberships, PayPal, Cash App, or Venmo. All of those links are in the description below. And also, if you're in Father John's area, go check out his parish. St. Jonah is the church. And Father, what is your website for people that are inquiring about your parish if they'd like to come visit?
It's Saint spelled out Jonah.org.
Okay, I'm going to put that in the comments. Say JONAH.org.
Right.
So SAINTJONAH.org.
Right.
All righty. That is in the chats, the live chat for anybody that wants to see that. And then I've got that in the description of the video also. And so if you're in Father John's area, go visit his parish. If not, well, we appreciate you being here anyway. And so with that being said, good night. God bless. Know that you are loved and stay like Christ.